Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're looking into the murder of Jiaomei Zhou in Flushing, Queens, back in 2021. You send us a bunch of news articles and press releases, all about the conviction and the sentencing of Quiming Wan. Who was the perpetrator in this case?
Yeah, it was a tragic case that really, caught the city's attention. And by looking at these sources, we can really try to understand not just what happened, but also how the legal strategy of the case kind of played out.
Yeah,
Oh,
sometimes the legal stuff is almost as interesting as the crime itself. Right.
absolutely.
So for people who maybe don't remember all the details, let's rewind back to November 1st, 2021. Jiaomei Zhou, a 29-year-old woman, is found dead in the lobby of Wan's apartment building.
And it wasn't just the location that made everyone suspicious of Juan. Right away, the police found blood on Zhu's clothing and then a blood trail leading straight back to his apartment.
So that's already pretty bad. But then when they went into Wan's apartment, things got even worse, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like, investigators found just a horrific scene. Blood everywhere. On the floors, the walls, the mattress, even the bathroom. They also found bloody clothes and towels hidden in Juan's closet.
So he wasn't exactly a pro at covering up his crimes. But let's get into the crime itself a little more. So the autopsy showed that Zhu died from penetrating blunt force trauma to her pelvis. What does that mean?
Well, it means that something was repeatedly inserted into her pelvis, and it caused like a lot of internal damage, leading to her death. That detail, plus all the blood at the scene, it all shows just how brutal this crime was. Even the district attorney, Melinda Katz, in her statements to the press, she described it as incredibly brutal.
Yes, strong language coming from a DA, calling Wan a dangerous person. It seems like she was trying to send a message.
Well, you have to think about the context. DAs are elected officials, so their statements often kind of do two things at once. They tell the public the facts of the case, but they're also shaping public perception and maybe even trying to influence the judicial process.
So maybe there's some strategy behind using those strong words. But back to the evidence. It seems like Wan wasn't very good at hiding what he did. Like, he tried to hide bloody clothes, even tried to move Zhu's body. But the police got there before he could get rid of everything.
And that's really important because those failed attempts to hide the evidence, they actually became key parts of the prosecution's case. Tampering with evidence is a crime itself. It shows that he knew what he did was wrong and that he needed to hide it.
Yeah, but ultimately he couldn't hide what he did. He was arrested pretty quickly and faced a bunch of charges: murder, sexual abuse, tampering with evidence, and criminal possession of a weapon.
Yeah, and the prosecution's decision to go after him on multiple charges, that was totally intentional. By having all those charges, they were able to show how bad his actions were and paint a clear picture of everything that led up to Zhu's death. And as we'll see, the strategy played a big role in the severity of his sentence.
And it makes you wonder what he was thinking. Like, did he really think he could get away with all of that?
Well, that's a good question for psychologists, I think, and legal experts. What we can focus on is how effective the prosecution was. And that brings us to the trial, which started almost 3 years after the crime in late September of 2024. The prosecution team was led by Assistant District Attorneys Courtney Charles and Antonio Vitilio, and they presented a ton of evidence.
3 years. That's a long time. It's hard to imagine how everyone involved must have felt, especially Jiaomei Zhou's family and friends. It must have been so hard waiting that long for justice.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But from a legal standpoint, they probably used that time to really build a solid case, analyzing the forensic evidence, interviewing witnesses, and putting together a story that would convince the jury that Wan was guilty.
And it looks like their hard work paid off. After a 2-week trial, the jury only took less than 2 hours to decide, and they found him guilty on all charges. That's pretty fast, isn't it?
It is. And we don't know for sure what happened during their deliberations, but the fact that they decided so quickly suggests the evidence against Wan was overwhelming. Remember, to find someone guilty, the jury has to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt.
So the jury made their decision quickly. But we know there's more to the story. What happened next?
Well, after the guilty verdict came the sentencing phase, and that's where things get really interesting, because the judge had to figure out a sentence that fit how serious the crime was, but also consider things like deterring future crime and the possibility of rehabilitation. And so in December 2024, Wan was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison.
25 years to life. That means he'll be in prison for at least 25 years before he can even be considered for parole. That's a really long time.
Yeah.
What led to such a harsh sentence?
Well, the brutality of the crime was definitely a factor. Remember what the district attorney said? Incredibly brutal, dangerous person, those statements. Along with the prosecution's focus on how Wan tried to cover up the crime, it probably influenced the judge's decision.
So it wasn't just about punishing Wan for the murder. It was also about sending a message that these actions won't be tolerated and protecting the community from someone considered dangerous.
Exactly. Sentencing involves a lot of different factors. It's about punishment, but also deterring future crimes and keeping the community safe.
And that's where we'll pick things up in part 2. We've talked about the crime, the attempted cover-up, the trial, and the sentence. But now we need to look at the bigger picture, the public reaction, and what this case tells us about broader issues in society.
I agree, because this wasn't just a crime that happened in private. It really affected the community, started conversations, and maybe even forced people to think about some hard truths about violence against women.
Right. And in part 2, we'll get into those very conversations.
One thing that really stood out to me when I was going through all this stuff was just how much media coverage this case got, even years after it happened. You know, the press releases from the DA's office, the news articles about the trial and sentencing, it all shows that people really wanted to understand what happened and see justice done.
Yeah, it definitely feels like this case really resonated with people. I saw a lot of quotes in the articles from people in Queens. They were saying they were shocked, outraged, even scared.
Yeah, I get that. This wasn't something that happened far away. It was in their neighborhood. It could have been someone they knew, someone they saw on the street. It makes you realize that violence can happen anywhere and that no one's really safe.
You mentioned the DA's press releases,
Mm-hmm.
and we talked about the strong language she used, like calling the murder incredibly brutal and saying Juan was a dangerous person.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just her statements, right?
No, it wasn't.
The press releases also talked about the work of Assistant District Attorneys Courtney Charles and Antonio Vitiglio.
Right. They're the ones who went through all the evidence.
Yeah.
And talked to the witnesses and presented the case to the jury. It's easy to focus on the DA, but these are the people who are actually doing the work, day in and day out. They were so important in getting this conviction.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that in every big case, there are a lot of people working behind the scenes. But we can't forget that at the center of all this is a real person, a young woman whose life was tragically cut short.
Absolutely. Jiaomei Zhou was only 29 years old. We don't get to know a lot about her from these sources, but it's so important to remember that she was a person, someone with hopes and dreams, and relationships that were destroyed by this awful act.
It's true. It's easy to get lost in the legal stuff and forget about the human cost of these crimes. And this case, while it's unique in its details, also points to a much bigger issue: violence against women.
You're right. And the fact that the evidence suggests there was a sexual assault, it makes it even more complicated. It makes you think about how vulnerable women are, especially when they're alone or with someone they thought they could trust.
It's a sad reminder that these things can happen anywhere, to anyone. It's not just limited to certain communities or groups of people. And I think that's part of why this case affected people so much. It made people realize that they're not as safe as they thought.
Right. And while the conviction of Quiming Wan brings some closure and justice for Jiaomei Zhou, it also shows how important it is to have a justice system that takes these crimes seriously. From thorough investigations to strong prosecutions, holding people accountable is so important, not just for the victims, but for everyone in society.
You know what's interesting to me is that even though Juan tried to hide what he did, the truth still came out. The blood trail, the hidden evidence, it all pointed to him.
Yeah, it really shows how good the police and forensic investigators are. They spent years putting the pieces together, looking at every little thing, and building a case that was really strong. It shows that justice might not always be fast, but it can be persistent.
And in this case, the sentence of 25 years to life sends a really strong message that these kinds of brutal acts won't be tolerated. But is 25 years enough? I don't know. Is any sentence really enough when someone's life has been taken?
Yeah.
And the people they left behind are dealing with so much pain?
That's a really deep question. And it goes beyond this one case. It makes you think about the nature of justice and punishment. Is it about revenge or about rehabilitation? Or is it mostly about protecting society from harm?
Those are tough questions, and there aren't any easy answers. But I think it's important that we have these conversations, looking at cases like this, talking about the legal outcomes, and struggling with these fundamental questions. That's how we can move towards a world that's more just and fair.
I agree. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by these kinds of tragedies. But it's important to remember that even small things can make a difference. Talking about consent and respect, supporting victims, and holding perpetrators accountable, all these things contribute to a safer and more just society.
That's a good point. But I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something else that was noticeable in the coverage of this case, the role of the media. Because it wasn't just about reporting the facts. It felt like they were really exploring the anxieties people have about violence against women. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. The media coverage went beyond just the basic facts. They tried to understand why. And I think that shows that people are becoming more aware and they want to understand the root causes of violence against women. Why do these crimes happen? What are the societal factors that contribute to them?
It's like the media was using this case to start a bigger conversation, a conversation about gender roles,
Yeah.
power dynamics, and the need for more respect and equality in relationships.
Yes. And by talking about these issues, by starting these conversations, the media can really influence how people think and ultimately help create positive change. Because being aware of the problem is the first step toward preventing it.
Right. It's about understanding the context, the societal norms, the power imbalances that often lead to these kinds of tragedies. It's about recognizing that violence against women isn't just an individual problem, it's a societal problem.
That's a really important point. It's not enough to just condemn people like Quiming Wan. We have to address the systemic factors that contribute to violence against women. We have to challenge those norms, advocate for policies that promote equality, and create a culture where respect and consent are at the forefront.
That's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it's pretty heavy stuff. But I think you're right. We can't just avoid these difficult conversations. We have to face them head on, learn from cases like this, and work towards creating a world where this kind of violence is unthinkable.
Exactly. Change might not happen overnight, but every step in the right direction, every conversation about consent, every effort to support victims and hold perpetrators accountable, it all brings us closer to that goal. It's about creating a society where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued.
That's a powerful thought. But I feel like there's still more to explore. We've talked about the crime, the trial, the impact on society. But what about what we can learn personally? What can our listeners take away from this case? Not just about the world around them, but about their own lives and relationships. That's something I'm really interested in.
That's a great point. Because while the case of Jiaomei Zhou and Quiming Wan is a specific event, a horrible tragedy, the lessons we can learn from it can really affect our own lives and choices. And that's what we'll talk about in our final segment, the personal reflections, the things we can all take away from this.
We've talked about the murder of Jiaomei Zhou, the trial and sentencing of Quiming Wan, and how this case relates to the bigger issue of violence against women. But now I was going to bring it back to you, the listener. What can we all learn from this case? Like on a personal level, what are you left thinking about after hearing all of this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I know it can feel kind of overwhelming, with how dark this case is. But it's important to remember that even in these tough situations, there are things we can learn, things that can even inspire us to take action.
Yeah, sometimes the toughest situations teach us the most important lessons. So what really stood out to you?
Honestly, this case made me think a lot about personal safety and just being aware. We always hear people say, be aware of your surroundings, but it's easy to forget about that in our busy lives. This case shows just how important that awareness is, not just for women, but for everyone.
Yeah, that's a good point. But like we said before, this didn't happen in some dark alley. It happened in Juan's apartment. So they probably knew each other at least a little bit. So it's not just about being aware of our physical surroundings, right?
Right, it's not.
It makes you wonder about trust and how to recognize dangerous situations, even when you think you're safe.
Exactly. It's about trusting your gut and not ignoring those red flags, even if they're coming from someone you know.
It's like we need to develop a sixth sense, some kind of internal alarm that goes off when something feels wrong. But that's easier said than done, right?
It is.
How do we even learn to do that?
Well, I think it starts with being open and honest, talking about consent and boundaries in all our relationships. It's about creating a culture where people feel comfortable, saying when they're uncomfortable, setting limits, and respecting each other's boundaries. It's about listening to your gut and speaking up when something feels off.
That makes sense. And it's not just about protecting ourselves. It's about looking out for other people, too.
Right.
Like if we see someone who seems like they're in a bad situation, maybe we should try to help or at least offer support.
Yeah, I think so. We often feel like we can't do anything about these issues. But even small things can make a difference, like supporting someone who seems vulnerable, speaking up when you see someone being disrespectful, or just being there for a friend who's been through something traumatic. Those are all acts of courage and compassion.
So it's about being aware yourself and taking responsibility for helping others too. But this case also tells us something about the justice system itself, right? The fact that Wan was caught, put on trial, and found guilty, even though he tried to hide what he did, that has to give us some hope.
Definitely. It shows that the police and forensic investigators are really dedicated. They were able to uncover the truth. Even though Juan tried to cover his tracks, it shows that justice can be slow, but it can be really persistent.
And it shows that it's important to believe survivors. Imagine if the investigators hadn't taken those initial reports seriously. If they hadn't been so careful about gathering all the evidence, one might have gotten away with it.
You're right. This case reminds us that even in the darkest situations, there are people fighting for justice. It reminds us that the truth always comes out eventually, and that lies, no matter how well constructed, always fall apart in the end.
Yeah, it's powerful to think about that. Even after such a terrible crime,
Yep.
there are still people who believe in justice, people who want to find the truth, and a system that, even though it's not perfect, can still hold people accountable for their actions.
Absolutely. And while nothing can really take away the pain and loss caused by this crime, the fact that Juan was found guilty and sentenced to prison, at least it shows that he's being held accountable. And hopefully it brings some sense of closure to Jiaomei Zhou's loved ones, even though it's not perfect closure.
It reminds us that even in the face of tragedy, we can find hope in the pursuit of justice, and in knowing that there are people out there who are dedicated to upholding the law and protecting the vulnerable.
That's a really important takeaway from this deep dive. Yeah, the details of this case are really sad. And violence against women is a very real and serious problem. But we can't let fear control us. We have to learn from these experiences, both personally and as a society, and turn that knowledge into action.
Action that can create a safer, more just, and more caring world. That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this journey, for exploring this case with us. We hope you found it insightful, and that it maybe even inspires you to make a positive change in your own life.